Hi, this is Michael Palermo. In this course on CSS3, this module, believe it or not, the entire thing is dedicated to just colors. Let's see why. In the overview, we're going to talk about opacity, the things you can see or not, RGBA and HSLA. What do those things mean to you, and how can you use them as color options in your CSS syntax? Then we're going to have some eye candy at the end by exploring some gradients. Of course, we'll have a summary that chats about all the things we learned in this module. So first, let's talk about opacity. This is the degree to which you don't want to see something. So we could kind of reference it as opacity and transparency. In this example, the first rule that we have here for CSS is referencing any class name called fading. And we're saying fading meaning, yeah, we can kind of still see you. So we set the opacity property to a 75%. And that's the syntax for that. If I wanted something completely gone, then I could use, let's say, the class name vanished and specify the color is transparent. Of course, let's see these things in action. Let's take a look at the CSS3 demos website and look for opportunities to where we could use those. So as we left off in the last module, our site's really starting to get close and starting to look and behave a little like a site. Let's add a little pizzazz. Maybe we can use some of this new transparency and opacity stuff in a way that would be appealing, let's say when we're hovering over things, such as in our header area up here. Let's give that a try first. I'm going to go over into Visual Studio, and we're going to focus on how to add opacity to, let's say, the title, specifically when it's hovered. Let's change the opacity so that it's at, let's say, 75%. With that saved, I'll go over back to the website and see what happens when I refresh. And when I cruise up here, we just see a faint change that's occurring up here to the title in our header. Let's do something similar for the subtitle. First, in the subtitle, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to set it up so that without hovering, the opacity is going to be at the same that the title is when we are hovering over it, and that's at 75%. Yet when and I could just copy this whole block here, when I decide that I'm going to hover over the subtitle, I'll want to return the opacity to be complete. And that's what I would do. That would basically mean 100%. So I'll save that, return over to the site, and refresh. Now, you could start to see a faint edge where the name is jumping down into the menu area. And of course, as I hover over it, I could see that it becomes more full. Then, of course, when I hover over the top, these kind of match now. So, just a couple examples of how that could be done. Now, another effect that might be interesting is with regard to some of our shadowing. Take a look up here. When I hover over these menu items, of course, they look okay as I'm hovering over them. But they kind of confuse my eyes right now. It's almost like there's too much of a contrast there. I'm going to offer a slightly different approach to how these can look by using some of the concepts that we just learned. I'm going to return to Visual Studio. In the nav section, the anchor tags specifically are what I'm going to be addressing. And what I want to do, I want to change the color of that to transparent. These are my menu items. Should I make them transparent? Let's see what's going to happen. Let's go back over to the site and I'll refresh the page. Now what you see is that, yes, the front part is transparent, but the shadow that's underneath is still there. So what a cool way to create a shadowing effect with our text. However, as I hover over them, well, now I get it popping out. So this is a little tip trick you can use to create that shadow effect and have it pop out as you're hovering over the items. That was accomplished once again by just simply making the primary color transparent. And then of course as we hover over it, in a previous CSS rule, it changes that color so that it can be seen. So now we're going to turn our attention to RGBA and HSLA. We're going to look at those terms and really compare them against what we already know. And you're just going to find out that there's just a lot of different ways to do the same exact thing. But depending on which one is more intuitive to you, that one's going to be just right. To help us appreciate what these things mean, let's start with something that you probably are familiar with. This CSS rule here is saying, for a class called dark cloud, let's make the foreground color #555555. Well, if we know our hex colors well, we'll know that that's because it's even all the way across. It's going to be a gray color. And because it's lower numbers, it's going to be a darker gray color. But let's break it down even further. The first two fives are red, the second two are blue, and the last two are green. So we can say that red equals 55, blue equals 55, green equals 55. But what do we mean by 55? Are you ready for a little math? See, really what we're saying is that 55 is equal to, take the first 5 and times it by 16. Now add to that the next 5. What you're going to find is that 5 times 16 is 80. Add 5, we get 85. So really what we're saying is that red equals 85, blue equals 85, and green equals 85. So why do all this math? When we're using RGB, this smoky class, referring to this color of RGBA 85, 85, 85, 1, is exactly the same color as the one we specified above. The one at the end is dealing with opacity. So show it at its full strength, just like we did with the dark cloud. We can do this same exact color using HSLA. This one's different. The H stands for hue. The hue represents the color spectrum. The very first number, 1, is red, and as you can see in the circle that has just appeared, it goes down to 120, which is green, then it goes to 240, which is blue, circles all the way back, and then of course we end up at red again. So the first number here is 0 to 255. The second number has to deal with the saturation of the color in percentage, the intensity of that color, whereas the third represents the lightness or light. And notice that we're saying let's start at 0 with a 0 saturation, but let's increase the light by 33%. Well, guess what you got? You got yourself a dark gray. And then the final number 1, well, that's referring to the opacity. But why is it A? Well, A is for alpha. What that boils down to is, to what degree do you want to see this thing? So we talked about before how you can have a class name called vanished and have it refer to a color called transparent. Well, you could accomplish the same thing here with, let's say, the invisible class name that refers to a color that's RGBA. Notice all zeros. See, a 0 in the alpha means you can't see it. Same thing for HSLA. Now, while we're on the topic of colors,